It's definitely an interesting time for us to be speaking. I mean, we're speaking at a very monumental moment in not just the recent war, but I think Jewish history. And I felt that way for much of the last 15 months, that what we've been watching unfold is not just another war, but it really is almost a turning point in our people's history, but also in the world's history. Definitely feels like things are happening after 15 months of a grueling war. And I think, though, that I, like many, am very torn on this. Obviously, as a human being, it's desperate, deep within me, that I want to see all of the hostages released and back home with their families. At the same time, I'm very anxious about the deal because all of the details that have come out so far don't seem great for Israel and don't look like a proper victory in real terms. Israel's decisions and choices are usually between two extremely unattractive options, and so when that's your choice, it's inevitable that you don't come out with perfection.
The Jew saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was. All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality?
Welcome to the Jew Function. Once more, I'm Leo.
Hello, I'm Seth. Hello, everyone.
And we are still on the front lines, combating anti-Semitism the only way we know. And I don't know if it's because of the work that we've done, but now instead of 1 in 4 adults showing anti-Semitic sentiments toward Jews in the last couple of years, the numbers have gone up to 1 in 2. So I don't know if it's because great work we've done to bring awareness, to shed a light on this topic, onto Jews. Maybe that light we shed has created more anti-Semitism. I don't know. I doubt it.
The diagnosis is you're halfway to the cure. So
yeah, I guess.
Bringing it to light.
Exactly. We do believe that, when everybody's aware of the issue and agrees that there is an issue, we can finally focus on the treatment. And I think that's one of the key points. We've been inviting many people here to the show to talk about this, prominent, really thinkers, writers, activists, people in politics and beyond, Jews, non-Jews. I feel like we're on par with the Oxford Union, almost, and maybe not as old. And we've heard a lot of great ideas. Unfortunately, a lot of them don't work. So what we want to also say is that, I don't want anyone to feel discouraged, because I believe this is part of the issue, that we need to see
raising mud over a few billion years until it finally becomes this perfected, loving creature is a long process wrought with many challenges.
Precisely. And so there's ups and downs, and it's okay. We didn't think it's going to be a silver bullet. And we are also here on a somewhat historic moment, even though this is a recorded episode, but it is January 15th, and there are signs of a hostage deal on the table. So it is I feel like the air is loaded a bit more. And and it's been a while since we spoke to someone from the little island on this side of the pond. Most of our guests are from the US. I think the last one from the UK was Reverend Haley, which was an avid supporter of Jews and the whole, and our cause. And so, on the one hand, part of me, it's a bittersweet thing. Like every time we get on air, it feels bittersweet because we're doing what we love doing. We're trying to open the discussion about anti-Semitism, really open it up.
Is that what we love doing? I think we love unity and love and a good life.
Fine, okay, but getting there,
we love looking great on the beach. This is the gym.
Exactly, and so this is the emotional gym where we really try to squeeze the hearts together and dig into our history and words from Jewish sages and a little bit of network science sprinkled in, and some psychology, psychotherapy. We really leave no stone unturned to find the solution to this problem, which I know seems like it's growing, but again, it's a good sign because it will point us to what's not working and hopefully toward what could work. So I'm more than excited to bring our guest today, because he's someone who's not only he's out there, he's in the media, he's a broadcaster, a journalist, a TV producer, and he covers stories related to the UK, the Europe, terrorism, extremism, race relations, Middle East. But he's also one of those people who is putting himself out there. He's not simply reporting or kind of writing about it from a distance. He's out there. He's just recently, I think last week or a week and a half ago, he was invited to the prestigious Oxford Union debate. For those of you who are not familiar, it's a great tradition going back to the early 1800s, and prominent people go there. Leaders, thinkers. I think people are familiar with some famous moments where Ben Shapiro was there and Konstantin Kisin was there and talking about the Jewish problem. And now we're really privileged.
Hamas. What's the guy?
Joseph. Son of Hamas. So now we are privileged to have our own Oxford Union. Alumni, veteran? I don't know. Fresh from the debate, Jonathan Sacerdoti, which actually means Cohen. So we'll just call him Jonathan Cohen. So Jonathan, please join us.
Hi, good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming.
So you are in the UK right now, correct?
I am. I'm based in the UK predominantly, yeah.
Yeah. So, we had this list of things to discuss, and we will get hopefully to most of them. But I think, we will be remiss if we don't address what's happening right now in this very moment unfolding behind us, somewhere not far from here. I'm in Israel. Seth is in New Jersey. You're somewhere in the middle, but not far from here. This hostage deal. I'm curious. Even though we're not really a sort of a current affairs podcast, it's hard to ignore the fact that maybe we're going to see a few more hostages alive back in Israel. What is your feeling about this deal and the whole this moment in time?
It's definitely an interesting time for us to be speaking. I mean, we're speaking at a very monumental moment in not just the recent war, but I think Jewish history. And I felt that way for much of the last 15 months, that what we've been watching unfold is not just another war, but it really is almost a turning point in our people's history, but also in the world's history. I would say that this hostage deal, which does seem now to be slowly being confirmed as happening. There have been a couple of tweets now or posts on X, as they should be called today, by Donald Trump, and it does seem like it's been agreed. Gideon Saar has announced that he's leaving his diplomatic trip to Italy early to get back tonight to Israel. I think it will be confirmed by the cabinet in the morning in Israel. So definitely feels like things are happening after 15 months of a grueling war. And I think, though, that I, like many, am very torn on this. Obviously, as a human being, it's desperate deep within me that I want to see all of the hostages released and back home with their families, those who are still alive and those who aren't, for their bodies to be returned back to those who love them. And at the same time, I'm very anxious about the deal, because all of the details that have come out so far don't seem great for Israel and don't look like a proper victory in real terms. And of course, in one sense, it's a victory to get back any or all of the hostages. But in another sense, we know what happens when you release serious terrorists with blood on their hands, as happened in the past, since the 80s onwards. And we know that Yahya Sinwar was released in the Gilad Shalit deal, and then we know exactly what he went on to do. It's just one very famous example, but there are plenty of others. So I think it's a very difficult moment for all Jews, all Israelis, in fact, all people of conscience around the world. It's a moment of potentially deep relief if we see hostages coming back alive, but it's also not a moment for celebration. I mean, it seems like Hamas is going to be left in Gaza, going to be left in control of Gaza. It seems like Israel is ending the war, which could or may not be a good thing in the circumstances, depending on how many of the goals have been achieved. So I guess I, like you, am feeling very mixed and emotionally uncertain about what's going to happen over the coming day or two.
And by the way, just as you were speaking, Trump already took credit for the deal, for his victory in November.
I saw it. He said the epic ceasefire agreement could only have happened as a result of our historic victory in November. To some extent, he is right, by the way, because this is when it's happened. It's happened after threats that Trump made as soon as he won. He said that there had better be some form of release of the hostages by the time he came into office, and that's pretty soon. So it does seem like that's put some pressure on. But actually, again, it seems like the pressure may have been put on Israel as much as on Hamas, and that pressure may have resulted in Israel making massive concessions which aren't really beneficial in the long run. Because it's worth saying that in these hostage deals, this is Israel's kryptonite, as I wrote in a column just yesterday in The Spectator. What I mean by that is Israel has shown enormous strength over the last 15 months. It showed total failure on October the 7th. But then after that, it's been miraculous watching its victory after victory in terms of military and strategic moves. But they haven't been unadulterated by awkward arguments with the US and others in the international community, and therefore slowing down of the war when it could have moved faster and cost fewer lives on both sides. And yet, I would say that a pressure by Trump, potentially, to come to some sort of deal right now may have seen Israel weaken its stance. And we know from previous hostage deals that the more that Arab terrorists see Israel's weakness in its resolve, which of course is also possible, you can describe it also as its strength in its humanity to return hostages and try to preserve human life, the more likely it is they're going to carry out future hostage operations, and the more likely it is they're going to carry out future terror operations with those terrorists who are released. And so we may be saving lives now, but we may be costing lives later, and not least the hundreds of soldiers who have died during this war should not be dying in vain just for Hamas to maintain control in the Gaza Strip.
It seems like many people who are appointed positions in Trump's case. We're not a political podcast here, but I just want to say I hope that there's many moves that are not, that we're not privy to. We have to think that these people should be smart enough to understand what we're dealing with, and that we're only seeing what's on the surface, and under the surface they have many other plans in order to achieve better results. Because on the surface, like you said, you're incentivizing them to take more hostages.
One would hope so, but I'll say this, that I think there's been a lot of optimism about Trump coming back into office in terms of the Middle East. But he's an unpredictable figure as well. That's part of his strength in dealing with adversaries. But I would say also that he's predictable in other ways, which is Trump is, I suppose, war averse. Trump is also keen to make deals, which is a strength and a weakness potentially, because a rush to make deals with enemies who want your complete destruction may end up in compromise. And any kind of compromise with an enemy that wants your complete destruction, or an enemy that has literally no boundaries or ethics, will kidnap, rape, murder, torture men, women, children, elderly people, babies alike. Well, I'm not sure there's a lot of room for compromise with those sorts of people, and a forced compromise in order to make a deal is not necessarily the best outcome. So I do agree with you that I hope there are parts of the deal that we don't know about which are more beneficial. Maybe there are sort of secondary parts to do with the expansion of the Abraham Accords, as he hints in that tweet, and with Saudi Arabia and what have you. But even then, I think that the state of Israel is at its best when it shows its strength. And negotiating and making compromises with terrorists is really the opposite of strength in some respects.
So what you're really saying is that it's a terrible deal.
Look, I can't tell you, because, as you know, the old cliche is anyone who's talking about it doesn't know the details, and anyone who knows the details isn't talking about it. So I can't say that. And I also can't say outright as a human being that a deal that returns hostages after 460 something days is terrible. There is something magnificent and hopeful and enormously relieving about the prospect of those people, or some of them, coming back. But yes, in terms of strategy and military and the long-term future, it might be a terrible deal.
But okay, so the question is, do you think that the West, and by now Israel, as being very much tied to the West and Western thinking, do you think we lost the touch, our ability to wage a war, to win a war? Maybe the whole world is sunk into this place where nothing is actually, can't get to a final, to like a decision, to a complete stop, right? Like everything kind of just gets drawn out. There's no real victory. There's no, what's going on? Are we like, has our aversion from violence has taken the best of us rather than just dealing with the issue, right? Taking the Band-Aid off like at one pull. We're trying to avoid conflict, avoid being, being the bad people because we're so humanitarian. It's hard for us to see ourselves in this position, and then we end up living the famous adage that says, if you're merciful to the cruel, you end up being cruel to the merciful. So, what do you see that? And isn't a similar thing happening in the UK as well in relation to this this wave of strange immigrants that don't share the same values and end up being.
I think to unpack that question, there's quite a few areas to discuss. One is to say that I think Israel's had a uniquely difficult task over the last 15 months. After what happened on October the 7th, it had a sort of dual purpose to its war. And on the one hand, it had to show the Arab world that it wasn't a paper tiger, that this legendary intelligence and military ability wasn't fake. It did have what it said it had. And it didn't look like that on October the 7th, not just because the attack happened, but because it took so long for any kind of response to really take place. I've spoken with people from the kibbutzim who were stuck in their panic, their bomb shelters, desperately trying to stay alive, calling for help, not getting it, to the extent that some of them were calling onto live TV shows, and the army still weren't there. So given that that's happening, there was the need for Israel to reassert its dominance and its strength in the region militarily and in terms of its intelligence. So I would say it did do that quite effectively, whether it's apparently knowing granular detail about the whereabouts of Hezbollah leaders, including Nasrallah, and then showing its amazing technical and daring intelligence abilities in taking them out of the pages.
But even there, we didn't go all the way. We stopped short of the Litani River. We didn't finish the job.
So I think that the second side of it is that, on the other hand, while you have to show a massive strength and deterrence to the Arab world, there's also this obligation to show humanitarian concern to, let's call it, the Western world. And it's quite hard to do both of those things at the same time. It's like they say, you can't dance at two weddings with one tuchus. So I think that Israel was, in effect, having to fulfill both of those. And as a result, it didn't really manage to do either completely. The Western world does not think predominantly of Israel as a humanitarian and entirely ethical operator in this war. And the Arab world doesn't think of it entirely as a determined and strong force that will stop at nothing, because they've seen that with enough pressure from the US or with enough pressure from outside, it will bow to these sort of fake concerns of Hamas for the humanitarian needs of the Palestinian people. And actually, we all know Hamas steals all of the humanitarian aid, or most of it, and what have you. So I think that it's had that dual purpose. But I'm one of these people that isn't too scathing about Israel in that respect, because I think Israel's decisions and choices are usually between two extremely unattractive options. And so when that's your choice, it's inevitable that you don't come out with perfection. And I always say, when people say, what's the solution to the conflict, or what's the solution to Gaza, or what's the solution to the war, I always say, if you want solutions, do crosswords. That's not what this is. Instead, Israel is just trying to do the best it can from a series of very difficult choices. And the hostage deal that's unfolding now is exactly one example.
But Jonathan, I mean, when I read the story of David and Goliath, he didn't just wound Goliath. It ended with Goliath losing his head. That was the end of it. There was no So what
There's-
what did we lose? You know,
David didn't have the UN breathing down his neck, and Joe Biden and even David Lammy and Keir Starmer
and Jewish lobbies against Israel. You know,
right. So, and again, I don't mean to be dismissive or mocking of all of those international bodies, because they have among their ridiculous claims, they often have legitimate concerns as well. I think we don't live in biblical times, so I don't know what the answer is. I would say that on the whole, Israel has done pretty well with the available options over the last 15 months. I would say that this hostage deal will be a really interesting one for me, because we'll see soon whether, well, it may not be soon, whether this was a good idea or a bad idea. And also we'll see what the details are. We still don't really know. I mean, I'm just seeing exactly as we're talking, and it may be a bit weird to watch this back, not in real time, but there's now discussion. The Prime Minister's office has issued a statement saying that it was actually Prime Minister Netanyahu's firm stance that made Hamas cave in at the last minute on its demand to change the deployment of forces along the Philadelphia axis. So there are so many details here that we need to know about, and to see who won and who persuaded who. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. What matters is what's left on the ground. Is Israel retreating and leaving Hamas to rule over Gaza? Even if it's diminished militarily, it can claim a victory and maintain control over the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian people there, and that is pretty disastrous too. It means it's a matter of time until it restores its abilities and we're really back to where we were. I mean, it may be 10 years, it may be less.
Jonathan, I want to point out that in the last few minutes, when you describe the situation that Israel is in, it really rings of the caricature or of who Israel is, of who the Jewish people are. We're in between. You said in between the East and the West, right? I hear it as just the same kind of concept, that Israel has always been this people between heaven and earth. It's like we are between these two opposites. On the one hand, we're supposed to be godly on earth, and on the other hand, we're supposed to be, well, you understand what I'm saying, that this is also an impossible thing, because it's not enough to just live in the ghetto, as in the Hasidic ghetto or something like that, or it's not enough to just live in our own little enclave. We're supposed to be people who are bringing the light of, a light to the nations, and there's no way. The books of Kabbalah talk about this concept that Bina descends down into Malchut, soils herself, like a parent comes down and goo 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 ga 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 in order to get the kid to grow. The parent lowers down and plays on the floor with the child. It's beneath, I'm a professor, I'm a successful businessman. What am I doing on the floor? But specifically, in order to raise the lower one up, I have to go down, equalize myself with the lower one, and then we're like, like someone who goes and hangs out with like troubled kids on the street. He has to go and he has to be able to speak on their level. He needs to be able to hang with them and then slowly influence from there. So Israel, we don't look at the people of Israel as just this geopolitical thing. We look at the concept of Israel, the people of Israel, as this eternal situation. And so from that light, if we just are dealing with, well, first of all, it's an impossible thing. It's an impossible situation. It requires, heavenly assistance or something, like standing at the Nile, what are we going to do? We need a miracle here. From that perspective, from like, if we were to zoom out, I'd like to hear you speak about it from more of a, the historical is not the right word, but maybe like archetypal perspective, right? We just spent, half an hour on the ground. But now if we look at this through a more archetypal kind of lens and who these people are, because I think from there we can be clear about our mission and maybe help us understand where the path forward is, because our path forward, we understand, is not just a political path, and it's not just waiting for a miracle path. Does this ring? Do you feel something in that?
I think that there's a distinction here in what we're discussing, and it's appropriate for your podcast, between Israel and Jews, between the Israeli nation, the state of Israel, and the Jewish people. And of course, there's a massive amount of crossover between the two, and even the parts that aren't necessarily crossed over in the Venn diagram still often have an awful lot to say about one another, good and bad. So for me, I think that, you know, among the things we were going to discuss today before events got in the way were all sorts of ideas about Jewish exceptionality or specialness or chosenness and the effect that has on us as Jews individually or collectively, and also the effect it has on non-Jews, those who love us and those who hate us. And I would say that plays into everything you've just been talking about and everything we mentioned earlier. This, for example, this idea that Israel has to engage in a war with the most ruthless of enemies and show its strength, but at the same time display to the world its humanity and its concerns. You know, this phrase I don't like very much, the most moral army in the world. I don't like it because it doesn't really mean anything. I understand what they mean by trying to use that phrase, but you can't really measure that. It's not really a quantifiable thing. Like, I can't give every army in the world a morality rating and then decide who was the most moral. But it's a very Jewish idea, I suppose, to say, well, we are the most moral army in the world, because when
it comes to killing people, we're the most moral at it.
Okay, so that's the first problem with it. And secondly, I think it's the idea that Jews, and therefore to some extent Israel, see ourselves as having to strive to set an example in our behavior. So when I was a child growing up in a predominantly non-Jewish country, I was always very aware that to some extent my own behavior didn't just represent me or my family, it also represented to some people Jews or my people. And there is that sense, I think, that you carry with you as a minority or a member of a minority group, that you are always, at all times, an ambassador. So Israel is the same in the sense that I think it is always trying to prove to the world that it is moral, humane, humanitarian in its concerns, but also strong and able to defend itself against existential threats, of which there are many. And the Jewish people, too, have experienced many existential threats throughout our history. So it's an impossible task to balance those two things effectively. And maybe it's one of the eternal challenges that we have as Jewish people and that Israel has as the Jewish state. So one of the things I think I realized on October the 7th was that we will always be hated by some people. It's perhaps a fantasy of Jewish people and non-Jewish people that we could eliminate prejudice or hatred against us or any other minority group. I think I realized the Jew is never someone who will be fully accepted by others. And that is quite a depressing thought. But at the same time, I think it's a really important realization, because it means that you're not necessarily aiming for this utopian, perfect world where everyone loves everyone, but you're aiming for a world of safety, of security, of strength to defend yourself, but always at the same time trying to set an example. And so I think when it comes to the issue of chosenness, in Jewish thinking, every nation has a unique role in advancing civilization. But I think that Jewish chosenness, if you think about how Rabbi Jakubowicz explained it in his writing, in The Condition of Jewish Belief, Jewish consciousness emphasizes moral and religious duties, not superiority. And so that's how I think traditionally we see chosenness. It's a lot of our enemies say, you think you're chosen, you think you're superior, you think you're better. Whereas I think many Jews who think about it understand chosenness to mean that we are chosen with obligations and responsibilities among all the nations. But we're certainly not supremacist, and we are not trying to convert or evangelize others. Quite the contrary, we make it virtually impossible to become one of us. We highly discourage it. It's not because we want to condemn others to not being part of our group. It's just that our role, according to Jewish teaching and thinking, is to be exemplary and to have a sort of spiritual role. So I think that in a certain respect, that is something that Israel grapples with. Though Israel itself, while it is the Jewish state, is not a state run by Jewish law or rabbinic law, thank goodness, in some respects. It has input from Jewish thought and thinking and the rabbinate in certain areas, but it's certainly not run according to Torah law in the way that, say, some Muslim states are run according to the Sharia.
I don't think anyone else is doing what we're doing, and and that's exactly it. Nobody can comprehend what we're talking about. Who would even say that anti-Semites have anything valuable to say without saying we're anti-Semitic or we're self-hating Jews? But there's something that everybody's missing in this whole picture, and the reason why the solution is so close is because we're not waiting for anyone else to change. We're not waiting for the laws to be enacted. We're not waiting for a new politician to get elected. The answer is way closer than everybody thinks.
Like us, hit the bell thing on the YouTube so you can get a notification when a new episode is up. Well, this is the Jew Function, and let's get back to our guest. Right, so I think we can't speak for everyone, but since we have you here, we can ask you, more specifically, how do you see this place of Jewishness? Because from what you said, it does sound a bit depressing, that picture, and one could beg the question, why bother? If it's so gut wrenching and horrific and all that, and we're doomed to suffer this way. It's like Sisyphus. Like, what's the story here? On the other hand, when you read the biblical story, which sort of gave birth to our nation, there is a destination. We start somewhere, we rise, we fall, but there is a destination. There is a land, a place, and when we leave the geographic expression of that land, but rather look, as Jewish sages refer to Israel as a desire, not a physical place, but as a desire that unites us. We all share the same desire. Yashar El, straight to the Creator, to that upper force. Okay, not some deity in the clouds, but a force, a high force in nature, force of love. And so that aspiration is there. That destination is prescribed there. And in fact, a lot of the things that were prescribed in that crazy quote unquote book, we see them happening. Like, the prophet said Jews are going to return to Israel after 2,000 years. Who thought? It never happened to any other nation. There you have it. So we kind of, we have this relationship with our history, with our legacy, with our sages, where like we take some things, we don't take everything. We kind of pick and choose, trying to please the nations of the world, but also be okay by ourselves. Where do you stand in this? Like, how do you see yourself as a Jewish human, as a Jewish person? What does it mean for you?
Well, I think that's a very personal question, in the sense that each one of us will have our own version of it. And I suppose mine will be specific to my upbringing and my background and my education, and then just my natural sensibilities and tendencies. So I can only answer personally rather than globally for all Jews. And in that respect, Jewishness for me is an amazing positive in my life. And it's deeply influenced by, of course, my family and then my ancestors and my history, as well as my own personal experiences and biography. My father, who died a few years ago, but he was a survivor of the Holocaust in Italy. So he was hidden as a 5-year-old child in first a convent in Florence, and then as the convents were being raided, his father, who was a rabbi, went and warned them, and he and his brother, who was 3 years old, were taken out, they were evacuated and taken to a Catholic orphanage in the nearby countryside where they spent 9 months. Now, for me, I grew up knowing that story from my father. And I also grew up at the same time as a very integrated member of British society. You know, I was born here in Britain and I went to establishment British educational institutions. I went to St. Paul's School, which you can guess from the name is not Jewish. And I went to Oxford University. I had really the best education I could have done in the British sense. And also from home and from my synagogue, I had a Jewish education. And my home, above all else, taught me Jewish values and Jewish ethics through not even lessons, but through the actions of my family, my parents and my grandparents. So
where did your dad, excuse me, where did your father get his values from if he didn't have his own parents to raise
Well,
him?
he did. Thank God. After the war, after 9 months, he was reunited with his parents. They all survived, him, his brother, and his parents. They were all separated and in hiding. It's an amazing story of utter selflessness of the people that rescued them, actually, who were members of the Catholic clergy. So while the Catholic Church was not exemplary in its behaviour during the war, certain members of it were, and the Florentine Catholic clergy were, you know, they're responsible for me being here. I have always felt, in my mind, because my father made me feel it, they saved my life. I wouldn't be here were it not for the actions of those extraordinary people, and at great risk to themselves. You know, there's a story of the Nazi fascists coming to the door of the convent that my father was being hidden in, and the Mother Superior, Madre Maria Agnese Tribioli, who was a tiny woman, stopped them at the door, held up her crucifix, and when they said they thought there were Jews in there, she is said to have said to them, "Here there are only children of God, and you too are a child of God." And they turned around and left. Were it not for that, who knows what would have happened to my father and the other Jews who were then in there. So I think that it's not just Jewish history that's influenced me, that the enormous lesson from the people who attained the status of righteous among the nations, for example, who saved Jews at great risk to their own lives, has inspired me, thanks to my father's activities during my life, to the extent that I would say that I consider human beings to have the capacity for great good and for great evil, each one of us. And it's my hope that we, when we are unfortunately challenged with decisions like they had, that we would rise to that challenge and do what is decent and human. And actually, just to focus this back on what's going on in Israel and Gaza at the moment, it's been something of a massive disappointment to me that I haven't seen any stories of so-called ordinary Gazan civilians, who we hear a lot about in the news, saving or rescuing hostages. There have been, as far as I can tell, I mean, maybe there's something we don't know yet, but not a single Gazan civilian has been known to have provided helpful or useful information to save hostages. In fact, on the contrary, I remember when there was one of the Russians' hostages managed to escape, he was turned back in at one point, if I remember correctly, by other Gazans. So that is, again, I don't want to generalize about them, but it certainly struck me as somebody who's here thanks to the kindness and goodness of ordinary non-Jews, that it didn't happen here, or we're not aware of it having happened yet. Maybe some of the hostages that were saved were as a result of some information. At one point, not that long ago, millions of dollars were offered to very publicly to anyone in Gaza who would help save hostages. And even with Hamas deeply weakened, it doesn't seem to have happened. So that is, to me, it says something about the cultures that we grow up in and what we're taught. So to bring it back to Jewishness, I was taught very much as part of my Jewishness to act in a humane and non-judgmental way towards other people in terms of prejudice, and to hope that I would behave as those non-Jews did who saved my family's lives. But at the same time, I think there's a great deal of continuity which is central to my Jewishness and many people's. So even if each one of us may not feel as deeply inspired by certain religious elements of our Judaism, I think that most Jews I know do feel at least a very heavy burden or responsibility of continuity, that our people, our ancestors have survived and carried out certain moral and religious and traditional activities for so long that our role in that chain of history is to carry it on too. And so certain things are fundamental to all Jews, even those who are apparently very unattached and unobservant. There are still things deep within us that I think we carry from our ancestors.
The way you articulated it it's beautiful. I mean, I think it was as close to a definition, but in using abstract terms. Usually we don't get a lot of definitions here on the talk when we ask people, and it's okay. It's as you said, you speak for yourself, and it's unique. However, we are often judged as a collective, certainly by the other nations, and so we strongly believe that anything you say here can and will be used in the collective consciousness of Jews, because that's just how it works, apparently. I think we are sometimes reluctant to appreciate it or to accept it or to admit it, but we are part of a collective, whether we like it or not. That's how the world sees us. So you could say it's by godly decree, by nature, a fluke of, doesn't matter. This is the reality.
Have you been recently to the Anu Museum in?
Yeah, of course. I live not far from there.
Okay, so I went when it relaunched to write a piece about it, and I found it fascinating because what it showed me, it felt very American, if I can say that without it meaning to sound like an insult. And it was it was, by which I mean, it was kind of like a brilliant, I thought to myself, I don't know what to make of this. It's a brilliant museum if an alien landed on Earth and asked what a Jew is, which was one of the things you suggested to me you might ask today. And at the same time, I couldn't help noticing that none of the bits of information on the plaques was more than 3 sentences long, and none of the sentences was more than 7 words long, and it almost felt like a kid's book version. And the thing that really struck me, but then I understood this was the point of the museum. It was trying to be the museum of the Jewish people. This is what it basically calls itself. And how can you be the museum of the Jewish people when actually there are so many different Jewish peoples, never mind Jewish people, and we often don't like each other that much or agree with each other that much. But yet, as you've said, there is something unifying that we all have in common. So to me, what we all have in common is our history and our heritage that got us to this point as a people. And we may now no longer look like the same people if you take one from every part of our denominations or locations. But we are ultimately united by something in common. And that to me is the long chain of tradition and history and heritage. And so that museum, one criticism I had of it at the time was that it's a very modern sort of museum now. It doesn't rely, as far as I could see, on the historical collection that a traditional museum relied on, items and things like that. A lot of it was information and multimedia and reproductions. But they had just bought the Sassoon Codex, which hadn't yet made its way into the museum, the oldest edition of the, as they call it, the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, that I think the oldest complete version. And they just bought it and they built this hall for it, or this room for it. And I remember thinking, this is entirely appropriate, because if this museum only has one genuine, real artifact in it, it should be that, because that ultimately is the thing, even if you're not religious, this is the thing that is central to all Jews, the Torah. And this was the oldest complete version they had. And so I thought that was a sort of good cherry on the cake. If you...
It's beautiful that you brought this up, even as if you visited Israel's Ministry of Department of Education and what's happening in schools, and the move from within the department, both in Tel Aviv specifically, but also the occupation of all the clerical roles in the Department of Education by foreign funds and other players that have put in front of them the goal of taking out that historic foundation of our people. No Bible studies in school. No, we don't even used to receive the Bible in second grade, right? Learn all kinds of traditions by 6th grade. A huge movement. Obviously, there's now a counter movement, but I mean, these people work from within the country, the establishment to trying to uproot. The only hope that we have is that education in general has been so terrible that even that type of progressive education might fail. But this is the thing that we're sort of trying to ask people, like, how can we keep these people together even with all the differences? I mean, maybe you have a solution, because you said, I'm sorry, I'm quoting you. You said that we need a concrete action, which is what is required. I don't know what you meant by that. I don't know if you meant toward the anti-Semites or maybe an action within ourselves first.
I'm sad to say that the only thing that I feel in my life that unites us in any kind of meaningful way when we seem to be pulling in all directions does seem to be tragedy.
Hold on. Leo, should we all guess what it is?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Tragedy, yes.
I think it is tragedy. And, October
we have
7th.
100 episodes saying
Right.
that. So, yeah.
But I don't think that that's true either. That's the point. I think that what happens is, all of us have endless conversations about this with our friends and family. So I think what happens is that as Israel is a good example, as are Jews all over the world, that we get lulled into a false sense of security where we think that we can occupy our minds with the same stuff that ordinary folk do. And such as, I don't know, judicial reform, dare I say it. And then just as people are ripping each other to shreds over something very important like that, something comes from outside to remind them that while that is important, there are things that are more important and require less division and more unity. And at those times, Israel certainly did show itself as able to come together and unite in at least the essential ways to do what it had to do. And I think that is something that is quite Jewish. I mean, I said the other day, actually, in a similar conversation, that I don't know, it's hard to make a comparison like this, but it was just in my mind. So I don't know if something similar, God forbid, happened here in London to October the 7th. And if the UK woke up one Saturday morning and found itself facing a genuine existential genocidal threat, if British young people in particular, but British people generally, would put on a uniform, drive of their own accord before even commanded to go and fight the enemy, and Brits from around the world, wherever they were travelling, would scrabble to lie on the floor of incoming aeroplanes because all the seats were full to join in that effort. Now, I don't think it would happen here. I think it's partly because we have so little experience of that anymore in my generation. And I think that in a sense, it's a shame, because what it means is we've utterly forgotten our culture and values and ethics and what they stand for and how important it is to defend them. And another thing that I've been saying quite a bit in the last week or so is that we enjoy a great degree of freedom in the West. Here in the UK, we feel particularly free, and have done all of my life. I've felt very free as an individual and as a society. But we need to acknowledge sometimes that freedom isn't free. It doesn't come for free. Sometimes you really have to fight for it or sacrifice for it. And Israel knows that, and Jews tend to know that, sadly. But I'm not sure that your typical Westerner knows it anymore. And I'm very scared that A, we as Westerners need to remember it and find it out, and B, it may happen far too late.
Do you feel that yourself part of British society, and do you feel that British society views you as part of it in the complete sense of the word?
I feel very British. I was born here. My father chose to be British and come here from Italy. It's like Olim in Israel are the Israelis who chose to be Israeli. And I feel that my father was a great Anglophile and decided to make his home in the UK. I was born here, as I said. He sent me to very British educational establishments. I've always felt British, and I feel very proud of this country, which is why I get so moved and saddened by certain things that happen in the country today, and more deeply fundamental things like challenges to our identity and our values and our ethics and our morals and our culture. So at the same time, I've always been aware in Britain that there will be people who see me as the Jew. And I was thinking about experiences of anti-Semitism I had in my life. I got to about the age of 18 or 19 before I remember consciously feeling anti-Semitism against me, and that was at university in Oxford. In fact, at the Oxford Union, because they invited the Holocaust denier David Irving to come and speak, and not that move in itself, but actually when we tried to oppose the invitation, some of the reactions that I experienced were deeply anti-Semitic, unashamedly and boldly anti-Semitic from my contemporaries, people who'd grown up in the same era as me, in the same country as me, and clearly not with the same guiding principles as I'd had. So that's when I started to look backwards and think, well, maybe it was there before and I just didn't even see it. So there were many moments when I thought back. I went to a British public school, as we call them, which means private school, and it was the oldest private school in the nation. Now, there were teachers there who I felt picked on me. I was a good kid. I did very well. I studied hard. And yet there were some teachers who I really felt didn't like me that much. Looking back, I wonder if it was something to do with me being Jewish, even unconsciously on their part, that they may have just felt I was different or my family was different. It's quite a waspish white school. I will never know. And I think that's part of the issue, is I think even when we feel very deeply British, as I do, very defensive of Britain and British culture, there will still always be people who look at us differently. And even though we're not differently skin-coloured necessarily or don't necessarily look Jewish, I get that quite a bit, I think there are differences.
No, but that's the thing. I mean, you in your Oxford Union debate, you talk about an appeal to a sense of reason. You sort of go back to that, the establishment of the debate, right, as a place to enlighten and all of that. But it seems like reason has left the building in many parts of the world, and this whole hatred of the Jew seems wholly irrational. But do you really think you can solve it with reason, or maybe we need a different approach here?
I think, particularly in Britain, which was at least nominally a Christian country, now I believe people who identify as Christian are in a minority in the UK as of the last few years, but it is still.
So the number one baby name was Mohammed.
This is a tricksy one because most Muslims name their sons Muhammad something. So I think if all Jews named their kids with the same name, the statistics would.
It's also in Israel, by the way. Muhammad is also
exactly. So I'm not too, as a measure of change here, I'm not sure it's the strongest, but I see the point that people are trying to get at. I think that
Birmingham and all those other places.
Look, there is definitely change in the cultural, ethnic, and religious makeup of this country. But what I wanted to say was that Christianity has a lot to answer for in terms of anti-Semitism. And so, if you ask where does anti-Semitism come from, a friend of mine who's actually a rabbi in Israel was saying to me that Christianity is possibly the biggest source of it historically.
We're not asking. We know already. But we're just trying to
if we think about it, why would that be? It would be because if Jesus arrived and the very people who saw him eye to eye, breathed the same air as him, did not accept the concept that he was the Messiah or the Son of God, and yet people later on did accept that idea, they will ask themselves, those who came later on, why did the Jews who lived next to him not accept that? And there are two options. One was he was wrong, and the other was they were wrong. If they believe that he is God and the Messiah, they therefore need to conclude the Jews were wrong. And therefore, it's not hard to see how that turns into the Jews are somehow demonic, have horns, are blind to God's Son sent to redeem us, etc. And so I think from there on comes a great fear of the Jew and a great demonization of the Jew, and that in turn has been translated into Islamic anti-Semitism, because Islam is another faith which came to replace not just Judaism but also Christianity, and to absorb us and them and our texts and our prophets as its own. So I think that as a sort of potted history of how anti-Semitism came to be, that could also be reflected in British society and British culture. But when you ask about reason, that I talked in my speech in Oxford about reason, I think reason is obviously, I think reason is fundamentally important in human civilization. I say obviously, it clearly isn't obvious to everyone. And I think that certain trends in the world today are pushing us away from using our powers of reason. But I think one of the obvious things about humans as a species is that we have this enormous ability and power of reason that other animals probably don't have. So given that that's the case, it's probably one of the things that has made us uniquely successful as a species and ought to in the future. So I would say that it's not true that everyone has given up on reason. I would say that there's definitely a shift, but I think that the people who reason the least often shout the loudest at the moment, and that's the problem. I want to bring reason back. And I think if we can do that, if we can encourage people to think and reason and debate and discuss and to research and to change their minds. Another really unfashionable concept is to change your mind these days because you found new stuff out or researched something. I think if we can encourage people to do that again, maybe we're not, done for.
Jonathan, if we look at humanity as a, by the way, I have 5 questions here over the last 15 minutes that I want to open up, but we already moved on. If we look at humanity and just arrange them kind of in a pyramid and say the ones, many kind of pyramids could be, but let's just say like reason, the people who are really using it are maybe towards the top. We see that the reason why a company like Coca-Cola would spend billions of dollars on advertising, I'm sorry, I don't know the amount they spend. It has to be hundreds of millions of dollars over their career, is because people are malleable, and you can get them to do something that might not, that they would otherwise not do unless they were constantly told to do it. So there's another thing in there besides reason that people, even when presented, there was
the Nobel Prize winner, the Daniel Kahneman, who showed that people don't make rational decisions when negotiating, right? And what Seth said, I'll bring you back for the question, but just to sum up what Seth is saying is we're feeling creatures even more than we are reasonable creatures. And in fact, reason is an upshot of our feeling, not the other way around. And that's the reason why trying to go, and I work in advertising, I know if you try to go directly to reason, you get nowhere. Because people have patterns, have certain things that kept them together with their tribe, doing what they're doing. And why change anything? It takes time, money, effort, right? All the rest of it. It's dangerous. But if you can make them feel a different way about something, about a truth they're holding, or change the way they feel about something else, they will then find the reason.
The situation we've been in this is trying to convince people that Hamas is bad. We're trying to convince people that we're fighting a just war.
I think of course you're right, and I think that this is a really interesting area as well, because as I said, humans have this amazing ability for reason, but we also have this amazing tendency towards emotion, and we're immensely emotional beings. In fact, I was speaking with a senior political advisor the other day to quite a senior politician here, and she was saying to me, when it comes down to it at elections, people vote emotionally. And I thought that's very sharp, and it's why I think you see at elections, politicians, smart politicians, or maybe just successful ones, know that what they need to appeal to is your emotion. So that's why at those moments, the motivating factors are actually usually fear or optimism about a change or the future. So we have famously what swept Obama into power: hope and change, neither of which are policies. What got Trump into power: making America great again. What gets other politicians into power often fear. Bibi Netanyahu, love him or hate him, has played on fear a lot at election times. And it's at election times that I think even the smartest, most reasoned politicians know that they have to suppress the reason part of their personality and just max out the emotion. And the more effectively they do that, the more calculating their use of emotion, often the more successful they are.
THEJEWFUNCTION is really it's a desperate attempt to change something about the rise in anti-Semitism that doesn't seem to go away, and looking at history usually ends with something terrible before we reach relative quiet again. But we don't want to reach something terrible. We want to do it now. So that's why we're doing this podcast. And if you like this, also consider leaving a small contribution on our Patreon channel. Right, we both have day jobs, by the way, so we're not hoping to make money from this. We're hoping to see some change of heart.
Any funds are used to get this out there, to get this to people. We consider this the same way you go out every day to get money to feed your family, put a roof over your head. This is also critically important to our future, to our safety, to a good world, not only for Jews, but for everyone.
Well, this is the THEJEWFUNCTION, and let's get back to our guest.
So I think that generally speaking, that's correct, and humans are emotional, but I can't chuck out reason just because of that. I think it's an internal battle in each one of us and then within our society between those two. And yes, the most successful way, if you're working in advertising, you'll know it best. The most successful way is if you can come up with an emotional presentation of your reason, then so much the better, because you can persuade people. And I think religions actually do this, some religions more than others. I think Islam, from my reading on it, also was pretty successful and continues to be, often because it rests on emotional responses and almost like a marketing or advertising approach. So the promise, if you read the Quran, of what you will get in the afterlife if you are a believer and you are a good Muslim, is a series of promises which sound pretty good if you're a 7th century desert dweller.
I'm sorry, John, even without the afterlife, we see that Christianity on one side appeals to this feeling of this meekness, mercifulness, inclusion, right? It's that feeling. And Islam appeals to the opposite side. It's a feeling of power, and that's what attracts people. Young people, British guys joining Al Qaeda and ISIS and all that. It's that I'm joining power. It's a feeling. It's not reason. It has nothing to do with it. They will come up with all the reasons to support that emotional decision that they've already made. So the question, I guess, is, if you want to sort of bring it there, is how do we harness what feels Jewish? Not the reason, and not only that, how do we work on that feeling between us? Because clearly we cannot control all these myriad forces around us. We're under the thumb of the US and the Saudis and the this and the that. And like everybody has a stake, has a piece, we're not truly independent in any sense of the word, except with the way we relate to each other and how we feel about each other. So how do we attack that? Let's use our immense reason, and you sound like a reasonable guy. How do we use that to cultivate that feeling, a national feeling, I might call it, among all Jews in Israel, Jews in the UK, in the US, because how goes Israel goes the rest of the Jews. We see it now, it's clear. So how do we cultivate that national, let's call it nationalistic, or that collective feeling? How do we do that without just the fear of death?
I mean, it's a great question. I wish I had the answer, because
come on, that's why we brought you here.
I can hazard some thoughts, which is just to say that, I think we've already discussed the big one, which is adversity brings out unity. But it's a shame if we always have to rely on great adversity and attempts to kill us. But as they say, all of the Jewish festivals they tried to kill us, they failed, let's eat. And so we do have a sort of cultural history of that being our unifying feature. But I think there are also many wonderful things about being Jewish, certainly to me. And I think that there's ritual, there's tradition, and there are ethics which feel correct and right as much as they think correct and right. So, to us, I think in the West, certain, you speak to so-called humanists who have made a kind of religion out of atheism, and they will tell you don't need religion to live an ethical and moral life in the 20th or 21st century. That may be the case, but the things that they assume are ethical and moral are deeply based on Jewish values. So I think a lot of those things, I mean, my friend Melanie Phillips is just publishing a book on precisely this, that the foundational values of Western culture are actually Christian and Jewish, and therefore Jewish in origin. And as she puts it in her book, which I haven't yet had the privilege to read because it's not out yet, it is Jews and Christians who can therefore save it, as she says. But I think the point is that we shouldn't forget that many of those things which just feel right ethically or morally are actually, in their foundation, Jewish. And so for Jews, that is an enormous unifier. And then for me personally, I'll say, it sounds maybe, as we're talking about these grand sweeping themes and ideas, it sounds perhaps a little more frivolous, but it's no less important. I find ritual an incredibly important part of Judaism that I connect with and identify with, and helps me feel Jewish and helps me feel at one with other Jews. So if I go to a Shabbat dinner almost anywhere in the world, even if it's a Reform Jewish dinner or an Orthodox Jewish dinner or an Italian or British or Israeli or Yemenite or American Friday night dinner, there will be things there that feel deeply familiar and personal to me, even if I've never met those people before. So I think that there is some degree to which the ritual, and ritual is a continuation of tradition, as this kind of idea of a thread that runs through all of history for all of us. Those things are incredibly important. And why is Hanukkah such a popular festival when it actually isn't a proper festival? I think partly because it has this really cute ritual of lighting candles.
Fried food, candles,
right.
timing.
These are rituals. And even crypto-Jews after the Spanish Inquisition, 1492, centuries later, you'll find people who didn't know they had any Jewish heritage who light candles on a Friday night somewhere in South America because ritual stuck. You could say it's God, you could say it's in their DNA, you could say it's a ritual that stuck with them, but however you choose to interpret it, there's something very unifying about those rituals. So without meaning to be too high church about it, if I can use that phrase in relation to Judaism.
You're British, so you can use it.
I think the rituals and the traditions are also really deeply fundamental. And other ones like Brit Milah and Kashrut, to some extent, are things which have survived through decades and locations and centuries and millennia as Jewish. And I think they bring us together as well. So I think that all of those things are potentially positives, as are the ethics and morals, and some of the things that many people don't even think are Jewish, but they are deeply and fundamentally Jewish.
So this is great because in a way we that answer we hear, like, we hear people are having a hard time defining what is a Jew to an alien, but everybody sort of feels comfortable going back to that. It's, okay, it's the book, it's these few things, Shabbat, Kashrut, this, that, the other, that creates a framework that unites people through the action. The actions unite, and then your opinions don't really matter if we all sort of move in the same general direction around those milestones, the holidays, the seventh day of the week, and so on and so forth. The problem is that we have, and I don't know how it is in the UK, but in Israel, that there's a chunk of the population, 10, 15%, maybe slightly more, who actively oppose that. They see it as a problem, as a hindrance to peace in the region, as a hindrance to their ability to pleasure themselves on a Saturday, whatever it is. And these are our people who are
mitzvah to pleasure yourself on Saturday.
I know.
I think it's a mitzvah to pleasure your partner, actually, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what I meant to say.
I mean, if you enjoy it in the meantime, it's also okay.
Exactly, but that's the point. They're sort of trying to sever that thing which we all, when pressed hard enough, everybody goes there. But yet there's this group that somehow rejects it.
So in a strange way, I think let's get back to Israel, not just the tragedy of October the 7th, but also good things about it, which maybe it took a tragedy to remind some of those people about. So I'll tell you, I kind of fell out of the habit of going to synagogue as often during COVID, obviously. And then after COVID, and also it's around the time that my father passed away, and I found going there, even though I did it most weeks of my life, I found it really emotional. I just couldn't bear to look at that place and see the seat where he used to sit and all those things. And one thing led to another, and I became a much more occasional synagogue goer. I still haven't quite remedied that. But one of the things that got me going a little bit more often again was October the 7th. And suddenly, a lot of people who never went to synagogue or who weren't religious at all in their own estimation, I found wanted to gravitate towards Jewish places. And there is no more Jewish a place than a synagogue. And when I do go back there now, one of the things that actually I find extraordinary is one of the most the synagogue I go to is a Spanish and Portuguese Orthodox synagogue, a Sephardi synagogue, Western Sephardi. And the tunes and the chazanut is beautiful. I've always enjoyed that. It makes it very hard for me to go to Ashkenazi synagogues as a result. I found it's very familiar to me, but they added something new in the last 15 months. And that is at the end of the service, after Adon Olam, the whole synagogue stands up and sings Hatikva. And I promise you, I don't think there's many people in that room who don't find that the most emotional part of the service. And it has nothing to do with our tefillah, our prayer. It is a national anthem. It is interesting to me that one of the things that has made people, even in that place, a building center of religion, one of the things that is uniting people successfully is Israel. So I think that all these things feed into each other, and maybe that's ultimately the answer to what we're talking about, is that none of these things on their own works. It's not that give us enough tragedies and kill enough of us and we'll feel togetherness, but it's to do with our response to those tragedies or to do with our commemoration of those tragedies. Again, lots of people depressingly identify as Jewish through their experience of the Holocaust. I've mentioned my experience, but I never defined my Jewishness in terms of that, I think, or at least it's not the fundamentally most important part of it. I think for me, the positives are much more important, but the positives often come in reaction to negatives or tragedy or difficulty or difficult moments. So adversity. So I think it's all a cycle is the answer, which maybe gets me out of answering the question properly, which is very Jewish in and of itself, right? Also, Jews love a fight and a debate and an argument. That's another thing that I think is great about Judaism and maybe is very Jewish. This whole, we always say Israel wrestled with God, Islam, submission. They're very different outlooks on religion and philosophy. And I think that there is something incredibly human, incredibly rewarding to the human spirit, or at least to this human spirit, about debate and discussion and argument, and even the way that the most orthodox of Jews will say, God gave us this law that we can't turn on the light on Shabbat. And so I've developed a light that you can turn on Shabbat by doing such. It's like the most Jewish thing in the world, that you think God doesn't want you to do something, so you found a way to be smarter than God and trick your way out of it. It's the most Jewish thing I can think of, because it's kind of, it's coming up with solutions, it's coming up with ways around things. It's very Jewish, right?
Yeah, that was, by the way, how I got turned on to this Jewish negotiation thing, when I found out that back in the day when there were payphones and you had to have a special token with a hole in it. I don't know if you know it, in Israel, they call it asimon, right? And but you're not allowed to carry mitaltalin, to carry things with you on a Shabbat. But what if there's an emergency? What do you do? So they took that, they painted it gold, put it on a necklace, and now it's a piece of jewelry.
It's like you see religious Jews all the time wearing their keys as part of their belt. So all these things are like, I remember seeing this kosher for Shabbat, Shabbat compliant light. It was like you revolved it and it covered the light, and you revolved and it showed the light. And I was like, guys, really? But I mean, it's flippant, but I do think it is also very Jewish, this idea of debate. I remember when I was in Oxford, so I was there, I matriculated in 98. So it was kind of the early days of the internet in people's homes and universities. And I did a module there that felt very modern, which was about the internet and literature. I was studying English language and literature. And so they were trying to teach us about hypertext, which is, of course, what is the fundamental basis of the internet, of the web, rather, of the World Wide Web, and links that take you off in different directions, so non-linear texts. And they actually taught us that the sort of archetypal prototype of this was the Talmud. And they showed us a page of Talmud. And, here's the text, and here are all the links that go off in that direction. And I thought, wow, Jews, apparently we invented the World Wide Web.
Seth and I, we went deep into the rabbit hole. The first 22 episodes of our show, it was really just us talking and going through the history, just trying to find those patterns and everything. And when you start to connect the dots, it's hard to ignore like all these coincidences or occurrences that have been pushing us a certain way. I guess
from Abraham in Babylon through modern day, basically, to a couple years ago.
Yeah,
these patterns that just like keep rhyming with each other, as it spirals.
So it's hard to
spiral, not a. Hold on one sec. It's not just a cycle, because even though it's very painful, we do get new discernments each time around. It's not just a broken record, even though the things actually look like you're just changing costumes and putting in new players and repeating the cycle. But there are new discernments, and we also see that that the Jewish people have made, like, the world is influenced by us now. Like we have this whole other thing about hubs and nodes. What happens in the Jewish people radiates the whole world now. Whereas 2,000 years ago, even if the Greeks came to the temple to learn from the prophets, it didn't just spill out into all the people within 5-10 years. It took hundreds of years or thousands of years. Today, even though these cycles keep happening, there's so many discernments in the meantime that now we're at the point where while these things happen, whatever happens in Israel, like we see today, you mentioned earlier, Leo, that the 40-something% of the world is now anti-Semitic. I mean, everybody recognizes us. There's
listen, I know you probably have to go. So right before we conclude, are you? We started this talk. Sort of defining the depressing state of, what we are, who we are. But by now, by the end of the talk, would you define yourself as an optimist or just like a stark realist? Like what are you in this?
Indecisive.
No,
I would say, it's funny because I've always fluctuated in my life. I mean, there was a long period of time where I thought I was a pessimist, generally, and then I also at the same time have always had a feeling of being very lucky, and I realized that actually what that's called is being an optimist. I felt very lucky about my father's story, and that his family were all saved in that way. I felt lucky in those respects. I felt lucky that I had this heritage that I identified with and found incredibly nourishing personally and spiritually and also educationally. I felt very lucky about many things. And I realized that was really a form of optimism. And then in fact, it's quite personal, but I remember when my father got ill and eventually died from his illness, I discovered then that I was a massive optimist, because he was diagnosed with cancer and told, you're not going to survive this one. Have some chemotherapy that may help you have some extra time, which was months. I did what everyone does in those circumstances and went and did a lot of Googling. And, there was a 5% chance of something like that, of a 6-year survival in this situation. And I remember talking with him, and he was like, at one point he said to me, Jonathan, you're in denial. You've got to face it. This is happening. And I said to him, I haven't told this story in public, so it's interesting. I said to him, no, I'm not in denial. I said, there's a 5%, I didn't spell it out to him because I thought he'd think I'm mad, but I was thinking to myself, there's a 5% chance of this 5-year survival. What I did say to him is, I said, you've beaten worse odds before. And I just think that in that sense, I thought I was an enormous optimist suddenly. I thought, because obviously it was deluded, and my father did die some months later, and I did know that was coming. But what I mean to say is I do find now that since then I've opened my mind to the possibility that I may not be a total pessimist. And I have recently settled on the mid-ground that maybe I'm a realist or an optimistic realist. So I look at what's happening now. I mean, it's a disaster what happened to Israel and to Jews since October the 7th, Jews in Israel and around the world. It is nothing short of a disaster. I don't know how it will end up, but I do at least see the potential for massive changes that could be, at the end of it, in the grand picture, positive. But it can never be positive that 1,200 people were killed. It can never be positive that the hostages were taken. It can never be positive that so many of them were abused and killed. Those things can never be positive. So I think speaking in pure black and white terms of optimism and pessimism is difficult. I prefer a good, healthy dose of realism. And maybe it's Jewish to have a hope and belief that we can rely on the fact that we're still here. So probably we will still be here. And that is about as optimistic as I think I can, put my money on.
This is good. Thank you for sharing that story. It was. I feel like the truth is often found in those personal stories rather than these big statements. How do you think we can advance from that? Some say this is not just not that it was just a big tragedy, but it's really sort of a revolution. What's happening on the Israeli street and Israeli politics with the whole relationship between the politics and the military and the judicial system, and generally how people view each other, and how we govern ourselves and how we conduct ourselves and how we relate to one another, and our loyalties and all those things, and also Jews around the world relative to Israel. It's nothing short of a revolution, but when you're in it, you don't know that it is. Nobody knocks on your door and says, "Hey, the French Revolution is happening right now." No, it just people are getting beheaded and the streets are blocked. But 50 years later, you read about it. It was the French Revolution, right? So, do you feel that this is a sort of an opportune moment to change, and if so, where are we going to end anti-Semitism? Which is really that was in the background of everything. We didn't talk about it. I think we said the word maybe twice in the whole episode, but how do we take that in that direction? That would be your closing statement.
So I mean, as with all your questions, I don't know, but I think. I say we should just carry on doing what we're doing and doing it better, which is perhaps a fudge, but also just I think it's fundamentally what we do as human beings, whoever we are, Jews or non-Jews. I think that we got to get better at doing it, because I think there's a lack of conviction sometimes in our values and traditions. And I think maybe what many people have learnt over the last 15 months in particular, again, Jews and non-Jews, but I'm speaking mostly about Jews, is that sometimes you need to speak up a bit about the things that you value and care about and defend them more, whether it's verbally or using reason or in other ways. So I think it's not enough to take certain things for granted as being great and good and assuming that we've reached a consensus on that and that they'll stay like that. So what can we do is reach out to more people around us to make our case, not in an argumentative or aggressive way or a divisive way, but there's nothing wrong with standing up for what you believe in and what you value. And I've always said that if you feel there's something wrong with doing that, maybe you feel there's something wrong with the things you value. And if that's what you feel, you ought to interrogate it personally and decide if you're changing your mind or not. So when it comes to Judaism, or when it comes to politics, or when it comes to Israel, when it comes to pretty much anything, that's something of a guiding principle for me. If I feel uncomfortable with my opinion on something, I really try very hard to interrogate it and to even disprove it for myself. And if that doesn't work, then I need to shake off the discomfort with that opinion or feeling, and get to trying to talk to other people about it. And in the process, I might make them change their mind or behave differently, or they may they may do the same to me. I just feel like, we've all got to be a little bit more overt in our expressions of our beliefs and our positions. And when it comes to Jews, often we do it in response to anti-Semitism. So as October the 7th happened, sales of Magen David pendants went up. I don't know if you've seen that anywhere, but I remember reading that thinking that's an interesting response. So many people have asked me, how is it? When I go to Israel, I always say this, it's almost laughable. People say, how is it in London? I'm like, guys, you're the ones with the war. But I understand why they're saying that. I get asked a lot, do you keep your mezuzah on the outside of your house? I was like, of course I do. In fact, I think if I hadn't done before, I would have put it there now. And that's my point is, I will proudly wear my Judaism because I've realized that if I didn't wear it proudly before in as many places, it allowed bad things to happen. And the response almost always to me wearing it out proudly is positive. I have to tell you that. Even doing what I do, even speaking very publicly on controversial or contentious issues related to Jewishness and to Israel, I have predominantly an overwhelmingly positive response from people around me. Might be to do with the people I mix with, but might not be. So the Oxford Union was an exception and a very big one, and I'm not blind to the problems out there. But I do think that we don't really have a choice anymore. We've got to make our case proudly but humbly and convincingly so that we can show that we really have the courage of our convictions rather than just doing everything quietly, keeping our heads down and hoping things will be okay.
Jonathan, here's a quote for you in the chat. Please indulge us and read it to us.
One does not live for oneself, but for the whole chain. Thus, each and every part of the chain does not receive the light of life into itself, but only distributes the light of life to the whole chain. Right. I think we all exist as part of a chain and as part of a tapestry and as part of a whole. So I think there are a million ways to say it, and many people who've expressed it in great ways, but that is among them. So I agree with that. And as Jewish people, I do think that despite all of our differences, we do always feel a sort of sense of unity underneath it all. That's the point.
Please God.
Amen.
Thank you. We're very happy to make your acquaintance. And
well, likewise, it's been a really interesting conversation, and it's my good fortune to have met you this way and to have had this conversation.
So that's it. We're stuck together for life, Jonathan. So feel free if you're in Israel or in New Jersey. It's equal opportunity. We'd love to stay connected and continue this great work. And we'll put for our viewers a link to the debate as well, because it was well worth seeing you standing up there. And please continue doing this great work, and consider us in your corner as well if you need anything. We're at the Jew Function. And as we say to everyone, like, share, comment. This helps us. We don't need your money. You can send it. There's a Patreon link, but we much rather you just distribute this conversation, because more people need to hear what we just heard today and find our place together here. So thank you, Jonathan, Seth. And we'll see you all next time we're at the Jew Function. And we're out.